Okay, good afternoon. This is a presentation from another one of my students. When we couldn't go to Perugia last year, I got a new student, and she's working on this paper. But in the middle of the spring semester, there was a call for additional papers for the Transactions in GIS special issue, and we did a tangential paper here that I want to talk about a little bit before I get to the specifics of TanDEM-X. The TanDEM-X data takes a long time to get, and so we didn't have it when we had to do the special issue paper. Okay, so here's the published version, and it gives you the other paper, which has been accepted, and it's just not quite yet out on the website at TGIS. So what we're thinking about here, what affects the computed slope, and we're talking specifically about arcsecond DEMs at 1 arcsecond or comparable scales. And there's 4 things there. And so that's sort of what we're looking at. The algorithm, the grid spacing, the map projection, and then there's actually an effect from the latitude where you're at. So we want to compare the slopes at different grid spacings, compare them at different latitudes, and we would like to quantify the relationships. Is it the resolution or the landforms that's causing the differences in slope? So I want to go over the key conclusions of the TGIS paper because I think that will be of interest to a lot of you. The first one, slope can be computed for arcsecond DEMs with the geographic coordinates. There's a number of programs that don't do this right, which is one of the things we found in TanDEM-X last year. We can treat the pixels in the arcsecond DEM as rectangles for the calculations. And if we compute it once when we open the DEM, we can do it by grid row, and it's much faster and doesn't cause much of a performance hit. The slopes of the arcsecond DEM correspond with those of a UTM DEM with square pixels of a size equal to the average of X and Y spacing. And reinterpolating the arcsecond DEM to UTM gives us different slope values. So what I have been doing with the LiDAR, which is very interesting with all the conversation going on in the chat about some of the earlier papers here today, is we're taking the LiDAR, finding all of the points that go into a pixel with a different projection or a different pixel size, use consistent rules to come up with a DEM, and then compare what the slope we get. So here is LiDAR UTM DEMs, again, all independently produced from the same source data from 10 meters to 90 meters, both the mean and the median. And you can see you get a nice smooth curve coming down, and the slopes at 90 meters are very different than the ones that you get at 10 meters. And then our key example for the paper was we looked at Norway, where there's a number of map projections that are used, and then the geographic is done at 3 spacings, because a lot of the DEMs at around 60 go from 1 by 1.5 to 1 by 2. A number of the other ones stick with 1 by 1. So we have a number of different projections and then a number of different geographic spacings, all of which are called 30-meter pixels. And you can see the rotations of these other projections. We've got Equi7, Lambert, azimuthal equal area, polar stereographic. There's a conformal one, as well as UTM and geographic. Okay, if we look at the average spacing in meters of these, it goes from 23 meters to 31 meters. Again, these are all theoretically 30-meter spacings. You'll notice the only one that really averages out to 30 meters is the azimuthal equal area. The UTM is off by a few centimeters. And the 2 extremes are the geographics at 1 by 1 and 1 by 2 seconds. So if we look at those 30-meter DEMs, we can see that as the equivalent spacing, which is the average of the X and Y spacing, changes, the slopes get measurably smaller, and there's a linear trend. I want to emphasize here that right at 30 meters, we've got the resampling of the 1 arcsecond to 30 meters UTM. And you'll notice that those slopes, except in one case for the median, those slopes do not match what the other 30-meter DEMs are doing, so that reinterpolating gives you artifacts when you create the slopes. If we look at the arcsecond DEM and compare it to the UTM grid with the same average spacing, there's actually 3 pairs of lines. So the 1 by 1 second is equivalent to a 23.6 meter UTM, and then conversely, the 1 by 2 is the 31.8. So we really are getting the same slope statistics. Now, we're not getting the same slopes at the same points, because when you change the spacing, you're calculating different number of cells and they're at different places. So it gets very hard to compare individual slopes. But when you look at the aggregate statistics, that's what we're saying it looks like. Okay, and then this just shows you that the 1 by 1 arcsecond spacing, as you go to higher and higher latitudes, it gets farther and farther away from being 30 meters. And that's the reason that they switched to the 1 by 1.5, 1 by 2, and 1 by 3 arcseconds at different latitudes. So for our looking at the TanDEM-X, we had 6 areas. They're sorted here by the degree of rectangularity in the pixels. That's the difference between the X and Y spacing. And it's kind of interesting here, the one that was at Norway, which is the farthest north, comes out with virtually the same values as the mid-latitude US ones. And that's because in Norway, TanDEM-X goes to 1.5 by 1 pixels. And so the actual ratio of the pixel sizes is about the same. The DSM and the DTMs that we created, because we did both, we took the 95th percentile of all the points that were within the point cloud for that pixel and the 5th percentile to sort of ensure that we didn't get either high or low noise. And the reason we like TanDEM-X is it's got 3 resolutions produced by the same mapping agency, we'll call it, at 0.4 of a second, 1 second, and 3 seconds. We looked at a couple of characteristics of our test areas to make sure we're looking at different types of landforms. So we've looked at geomorphons, we looked at Mabeck and others, and we looked at the Sentinel land cover. So we're seeing a number of different areas here. Okay, so finally, here is our slope map. The TanDEM-X, the LiDAR DTM, and the LiDAR DSM at the 3 resolutions. You notice that as you go from left to right, the pixels become obvious, and so we're losing a lot of detail. We are also losing the steepest slopes, which are the ones in purple. But if we look at each scale, they're very similar in terms of what we're seeing. So the TanDEM-X and our resampled LiDAR are giving us a very similar picture. This one shows us the mean slope. Again, we've got the colors there for the LiDAR DSM, LiDAR DTM, and the TanDEM-X. So the mean slope and the slope standard deviation. If you go to the 3 arcsecond scale on the right, the LiDAR and the TanDEM-X are very similar. There are some exceptions, but by and large, they track very closely. And we notice if we get to the 0.4 second, there is a wide diversity. And sometimes the TanDEM-X is less, and sometimes it's more than the LiDAR ones. I think this is that the TanDEM-X 0.4 second is very noisy. And the noise goes out when you get to 1 second and 3 second. And this is just sort of an indication as your cell size changes, and with the different slopes, how much elevation difference is there in each cell. So you notice if you're down there at the 1% or the 5% slope, there's very little elevation difference in the cell. And as you get up to the higher slopes, there's a huge elevation difference there. And again, all of these, other than perhaps our LiDAR DTM, are seeing the vegetation, and we have to accept that they're giving us something that is maybe, as we talked this morning, somewhere between the DTM and the DSM, but maybe closer to the DSM. One of the most interesting aspects that we looked at that I'm not quite sure how to interpret yet is we moved the DEM. So we took the topography of, say, Oahu, which is actually there at a little over 20 degrees, as indicated, a little black symbol. And we said, okay, if it was at 0, 1 second would be 30 by 30 meters aback. And if we moved it up to 70, it would be rectangular, very different. If we calculated a DTM with that size, what average slope would we get? And you notice that it gets steeper. And it gets steeper for all of them, which I think is because, you know, you've got the two partials, and as you move your pixel to different locations, one of your partials changes and the other one doesn't. So that will cause a difference. But the one that really struck me is what's going on there at Guam. So we look at Guam where it really changes a lot. And the first thing we looked at the aspects. And so these are aspects, and I've calculated the average vector, its magnitude and direction. So those are the little numbers next to the name. And Guam is very similar to everything else except Oahu. And Oahu is just because I picked one side of a big ridge. So everything is looking down toward the west. So it's got a very different average vector. But I don't think Guam is significantly different compared to the other ones. So I don't know why Guam is by aspect. I also did the statistical slope orientation diagram, which is a combination of aspect and slope. And Guam is in the upper right, and it doesn't look that much different from some of the other ones. So we really don't know what's causing that, except to say that if you're comparing landforms at different latitudes with the arcsecond DEMs, the more northerly or farther southerly one closest to the pole will have a slightly steeper slope because of the fact of the pixels are rectangular and you're computing over a different area. Finally, I've got the visual, and this isn't zoomed in enough to really see anything. The one thing, if you look carefully at the southwest corner over there of El Hierro on the Aster, it's missing a bunch. It's missing a lot of land there. And if you look at the TanDEM-X, which is on the lower right, there's some holes in there. That one of the things that TanDEM-X data, which I guess is a experimental, and if you want the cleaned up final version, you buy it somewhere. But the holes are not filled in. So we would like to thank DLR for providing the student with the two data sets that are only available for research for our 6 areas, and the 3 countries that provided the free LiDAR point clouds. So if we conclude, the computed slopes for TanDEM-X decrease, and that's sort of typical for all DEMs, but that means if you're comparing slopes, you got to make sure you've got similar DEMs. The 0.4 second DEM is noisy and differs the most from our LiDAR grids, and the 3 second is very similar. And then there's just a number of interesting or annoying things about TanDEM-X. The elevations are referenced to the ellipsoid instead of the geoid. They lack the whole fill. The oceans aren't flattened. So if you look at the 2 little snippets on the bottom, the colors are all messed up because the oceans aren't flattened, and the geotiff headers don't say what the missing value data is, and the missing value data isn't consistent. And there's some anomalies on land, such as the various holes that have not been filled. So with that, I didn't start my timer, but I assume I have some time for questions or they'll kick me off. So are there any questions?